talk about prepping MDF just from raw wood, and then let's talk about like how you're going to approach it from primer sanding to eliminate those track lines.
Okay, so let's talk about where the track line comes from in the first place.
Okay.
So this tool here, you see I've got an air hose on it, and its natural tendency is to put more pressure on the back of the pad. And then when I grab that tool with my hand, most of my weight is at the back of the tool.
Right.
Right? Very common, very typical. So you're going to tend to put more pressure at the back versus the front. And that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So what I like to do, you can try and train yourself or your operators, whoever's doing the sanding, and say, look, instead of holding a tool back here, holding it almost like a gun. It's called a palm sander because it's designed to grab it up at the top. If you grab it up at the top, you're now putting your weight directly down on the tool, not so much like that. That's going to help for a start. So what I typically do on the center panel of the door, again, I use that rubber interface pad, and maybe after I can explain to you the difference between leveling abilities of the rubber pad with a coated abrasive on it versus a 10 millimeter foam pad versus a 5 millimeter foam pad, because they're all different. And I'll explain that. I'll explain the leveling is the key thing when it comes to the application. I can show you this best. The way I'm putting my pressure, I'm almost not putting much pressure at all.
Yeah.
And when I'm done, if I made any of that, I blend it out in the middle at the end. That's what that pass is to try to do, to try to take away any track marks that I've created. Now, what I'll always do, especially with dark colors, is after I've leveled it, and this levels like crazy, I take that off, and I'll go to a very fine 10 millimeter sponge, and I'll just give it a quick buzz. Nice thing about these things is they're less prone to create track marks because of their density. So they'll flex more, harder to make marks with it, versus a traditional coated, easier to make marks, it's more aggressive. So I would just do a quick buzz around with that guy. Again, just trying to take out any lapping marks or track marks that I made. And if you get used to holding your sander just like you do with your spray gun, usually you take your hose in one hand, right?
Yeah.
And if you can take that hose out of the equation, don't let it drag and pull your tool down and create excessive fatigue on yourself. Just kind of take some weight off of it so you can keep your tool flat. And that will help a lot with track marks.
Gotcha. Good deal.
Sand the primer. Same exact thing when you go to sand the primer. No different. You're using the rubber pad first. You're using a fine, or very fine, I should say, foam pad afterwards to blend things out before you shoot your black top coat or your dark top coat.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second. Why going to the fine pad, especially with water-based materials, is so many of them you can get the scratch marks because there's not a whole lot. They don't have enough opacity to them that it's almost like shooting a tinted white clear, so you don't get good coverage and they don't fill those scratch marks and they telegraph through. So that's the reason for that. Am I right?
The reason for using this pad?
The very fine after the 320 when you're doing primer.
Yes. I use the very fine after the 320 because it's a little higher grit than 320 and it's foam. Yeah. So it's going to take out, if I got any scratches from the 320 that I leaned a little too heavy, it should take them out. So it's kind of going to just polish it up another step higher. It'll hopefully blend in any track marks you may have left behind by accident. So yeah, I use it for that reason.
Okay.
You can use it all by itself only instead of the rubber pad that I talked about. But I just find it's not aggressive enough.
Right.
It doesn't level the same way. And you'll see that especially when you go to sand primer. If you take one of the 10 millimeter pads in fine for primer, it's usually more than you need, and you take 320 grit on this rubber pad, you'll find that this levels your primer in seconds.
Yeah.
And this is going to take twice the time, maybe
Right.
3 times.
Right.
Because it's just not as firm, right?
Yeah.
The density is softer.
Yeah.
So when we talked about density, let's talk about leveling. With sponges, you've got your 5 millimeter and then your 10 millimeter. And you've got your, where did that guy go? You got your 1/2 inch thick. Okay. Your 1/2 inch is obviously your very, very soft density. Very good for sealers, very good for profile sanding like we showed you. But when it comes to flat surfaces, people are generally going either 5 mil or 10 mil. 5 mil, 10 mil, I find is slightly more density than 5 mil. So 10 mil levels better than 5 mil.
Interesting.
Then you go to the next step. You put the rubber pad on it. It levels better than the 10 mil. So there's your different levels of leveling. So most leveling, intermediate, and least. And this doesn't level anything. So that's not even a consideration when doing flats on primers and solid colors. Then there's the other thing that goes on a 3x4, which is this. They call them pad savers.
Right.
Or interface pads. It's just Velcro on both sides. Using this machine direct, it's okay, but you might find that sometimes you get a little bounce and a little vibration. And when you're doing edges, you'll get a little bounce, a little vibration here and there. By throwing this pad saver in between and then putting your paper on there, now you've got extremely good leveling. This is what I would normally do all the way around. This is a primer door with our tandem blocking primer, by the way, the new stuff. And just got to say, it is like glass. It's
Nice.
So I'll do the stiles and rails with the little thin interface pad. I'll do my edges with it. Okay, you see how fast I did that, and I don't think I burned through anywhere. And that's really, really leveled. Then I'll take the foam pad and use that in the middle. And for these details, we didn't really get into those details yet. I like to take one-sided sponges. Okay, there's lots of different versions of these out there. I like to take these guys, and I'll typically cut that into 3 pieces. And I find it's very easy to hold when you fold it on itself. And now I've got kind of like a razor edge here, straight line edge, and I'll use that to get in here. And if I want to use it, I can get in that way with it as well, and gets right into my corner properly.
Okay.
And I'll use the same thing in here, and various profiles. If I had a door like this guy, I would turn them around this way and use that to get in there. This one's got like a reverse bullnose in here, so I'll just take the pad this way and use that to get in my reverse bullnose.
Okay.
And I'll turn it around this way, and I'll get my miter, my edge. I'll do this in the corners.
Nice.
And I'll just kind of put some pressure and jam it into certain spots that I need to.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I'm working on one of these 2 surfaces. I'm putting it this position here, and I'm working off of the edges to get into my corners nicely.
Now, is that a foam one, or is that the one?
Yes, this is foam.
Okay.
This is a sponge. This is grain bonded onto a foam back. It's basically similar to the 5 millimeter guy.
Okay.
Similar to this for the 3x4. Difference being this one's a white aluminum oxide instead of a brown aluminum oxide. We didn't really get into white aluminum oxide earlier. I'm sorry. It's kind of a in between silicon carbide and brown aluminum oxide.
All right.
It's a little bit more, a little finer scratch. Again, a little bit more friable than the regular brown aluminum oxide. But yeah, so most of those gray sponges are that. And you can get these sponges as well in this brown aluminum oxide. They're a little more stiff, more stiff, but I find they last. 4 times longer than the gray ones do typically.
Gotcha.
Love using for that. I take that Film Tech product and I fold it in half, and you see what I've got there.
Yep.
And you see how well that gets in there.
Yeah.
So I take that guy back and forth.
Gotcha.
That gets the fuzzies out. I even do that in the raw MDF stage too, because that's where it's the worst from the routering, right? So I take that and I go on there with that.
Now, what grit were you using when you were using that foam? Was that fine, very fine, medium? The foam pad that you were using?
The 10 mil thick?
No. The hand sponge.
Oh, the hand sponge. So typically, I only need 2 of these in my arsenal. I have fine and I have super fine.
Okay.
And I use fine typically for sanding all my white primers. I'll use fine on any light colors, last primer sanding prior to finish, and I don't generally get any scratching, telegraphing through with Envirolax top coat.
Right.
If you've got a different top coat where it's not hiding as well or the solids are a little lower, step up to a super fine on your last sanding.
Gotcha.
Use fine. If you're doing a prime sand prime situation, use fine on the first prime all day long, because you're going to trap any scratches with your next primer.
Sure.
When you're doing dark colors, fine on the first coat. When you go to do your last sanding step prior to top coat, super fine. Like 320, 400 kind of thing.
Right.
This fine is around 240 roughly.
Yeah, 240, 280, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do a rundown of all right, so what's the package that we need if we're going to sand a traditional wood door and MDF door? Let's kind of line it up what your recommendation would be with the products that you've just showed us right there. This is what we need in our arsenal, sort of.
Okay. So raw maple MDF door, raw maple doors, cherry doors, oak doors, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
The 1/2 inch soft density medium. One item.
Now, is that going to be? Now, are we talking about finish sanding, or are we talking about? Let's make sure we separate this. So let's do the package for the
prior to stain.
Okay, good deal.
Before stains. Let's start before stain.
Okay.
So medium 1/2 inch. Get some of these with 180 grit. These rubber pads with 180 grit. Get more than one so you can cut some. You can't do it both ways, right?
Right.
So rubber pad, medium, 180 grit sandpaper for all your flats. And that's basically all I would use. If I needed to, if I had some details that for whatever reason I needed to be a little more aggressive with my profiles, get some of these guys in fine.
Okay.
So those items right there. Rubber interface pad, 180 paper, fine sponge, medium sponge for all your profiles and everything.
Okay.
You're going to do your edges with this. Sorry, one other item you need. That pad.
Right.
So those 5 items.
Okay, perfect.
Do all your surfaces, stiles, rails, edges with this on the tool. Profiles with the medium. If you need to cut this to get into deeper spots, put that in between as we showed you, or just use one of these and one of these to do all your profiles. That's prior to stain. That's for your solid wood applications. Now for your finish sand or sealer sanding, after sealer, I would go with this guy with 320 grit on all your flats and edges. Edges, I'd be careful with that.
Yeah.
I would use this on all your flats if you're comfortable using this on your flats.
Right.
Some guys don't even like to use any power tools on sealer sanding because they find it cut through too easily.
Okay.
So you could do sealer sanding with a superfine sponge only. You could literally do the whole door with one of these if you wanted to. Or I would add, for sure, this is where that 10 mil really comes into play. The 10 millimeter density, but instead of fine, I would go up to very fine.
Okay.
very fine in that, super fine in that. That's pretty much all you're really going to need, to be honest with you. You won't really need the aggressive sandpaper and the interface pad for that. Too dangerous, too risky, too easy to sand through. And on edges, I wouldn't take blocks or anything like that. I'd take my super fine on my edge of my door and just do that, or else you know how easy it is to sand through on your corners.
Yeah.
And cut stain, and that's not what we want to do. So
I don't have that problem anymore because I'm putting on a lot of material.
Yeah. Well, if you load it up, that definitely helps.
Yeah.
So depending on the condition of your MDF when you get it from your supplier, if it's literally right off of the router and it hasn't been touched at all, I'll take this guy with 180 grit.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do all my edges of my doors with this. I might buzz the inside real fast.
Okay.
I don't generally touch the stiles and rails at all. If it hasn't been machined, you don't need to sand it. A lot of guys make the mistake of sanding everything with 120 grit. I'm like, oh, you just rip the pores. You rip the fibers way open with that rough grit, and you make it worse. So these surfaces are already pre-polished from the factory. You don't need to touch those, just the machine part. And then I go over it again with 320 grit, and that's really makes a big difference, especially on the center panel and the edges.
Yeah.
Go to your 320 grit. Then,
now you're going to use that. You're going to use that foam pad though in there in the center panel, correct?
Why don't I prep this door the way I would and show you that?
Okay, fair enough.
I'll just walk through it. 180 grit with interface pad, or pad saver as they call them. Then 180 on the rubber pad. And we can take our fine and we can hit this edge here that we haven't done anything to. Okay, polish that up a bit because you always got a lot of tooling marks there.
Yeah.
And if you don't polish those up quickly, you're going to see something. Okay, so I just gave it a quick 180. Now I'm going to just repeat with 320. And this isn't a case that the MDF is really bad to begin with. If it was smooth to begin with, you could skip the 180 step and just go straight to the 320. Maybe 20 on the rubber pad again. And I'm done. That's it. Ready to go to primer. Right. Now after primer. So you've got options with primer. There's so many different types of primer. There's prime sand, prime paint. There's prime don't sand, prime sand paint, or as we call it, a double prime. A lot of guys don't want to sand in between. There is a benefit to doing it. I think you've tried both ways with a primer. Yep. You can get away with double prime, no sanding in between, and it comes out real nice, but it's not quite as smooth as if you did sand in between.
Yeah.
So sand in between, don't sand in between, whatever you choose, it's pretty much all 320 grit to me. 320 grit, and like I said, with a light color, fine sponge. Again, fine sponge in here. Let me grab this guy. This guy is prime. So fine sponge in there. And those profiles. and back. Rubber interface pad with 320 in the center panel only. One thing guys make the mistake of doing, and I'll warn you, don't use this rubber interface pad for everything. Guys get lazy, they don't want to change back and forth, and they say, okay, I'm going to just use this here. Well, if you use it here, you got to be real careful because you can put pressure and you can cut through.
Yeah.
That's why I take it off for the stiles and rails, just for the center panel. And then after that, you could do a quick last kiss with very fine 10 mil firm everywhere. Stiles, rails, center panel, back. You can even buff the edges real quick with it. So you got package it up here. Interface pad with 180 on the raw MDF if it's really bad. Skip the 180 and go straight to 320 if it's not really bad. Then for your primer sanding, fine sponge. So there's your 4 items for your raw MDF prep. 180 and 320 and a fine sponge, that pad, and same thing, rubber interface pad.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right.
Primer sanding. I think we've covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And most of the most common day-to-day stuff, especially for the smaller guy doing hand application. The only other thing that we didn't say here, I've been doing all my demonstrations here with air non-vacuum tools. These things are available in an electric version, just plug into the wall. All of these tools can be used with various types of, I'm going to just turn this camera here. There's various vacuum systems. That's a Dynabrade vacuum system that can be used with air or electric tools. That's a Merca vacuum system that can be used with air or electric tools. And when it comes to the vacuum systems, they're all designed where when you turn the tool on, the vacuum turns on, and when you turn the tool off, the vacuum automatically turns off.
Perfect.
So you've got all those options.
All right. Well, hey, thanks so much for the time. I think we got a lot of good material. I know that I always like these things because I always get something out of them, and I've learned some new tricks just from the demonstration that I'm going to try and implement in some of my sanding. So, as always, we really appreciate it, man.
All right. Well, we always appreciate spending time with you, Eric. Thanks again for having us on your channels, on your programs, and all the great stuff.
We will definitely do it again, sir.